What if everything you were ever taught about the origins of Western philosophy was a lie? What if the men history calls the fathers of wisdom, Plato, Pythagoras, Thales, were not originators, but students? What if the real classroom was not Athens, not Rome, but the Nile? Sit with that for a moment, because once you follow this trail, you cannot unsee it. Let us begin at the foundation. Long before Greece produced a single philosopher, Egypt had already built one of the most sophisticated intellectual civilizations the world had ever seen. This was not a civilization of myth and mystery alone. This was a civilization of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, architecture, ethics, and cosmology, a civilization that had been constructing the architecture of thought for thousands of years before the Greeks arrived. The temples of Egypt were not merely houses of worship, they were schools. The ancient Egyptians called them the Ankh, the house of life. Inside those sacred walls, priests trained for decades in the arts of reading, writing, geometry, medicine, and what we today might call philosophy. The study of the divine order of the universe, the movement of stars, the nature of the soul, the ethics of governance, all of this was already deeply embedded in Egyptian intellectual culture before Plato ever wrote a single word. So when Greek thinkers began traveling to Egypt, they were not going as teachers, they were going as students. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, a Greek himself, wrote in his work Bibliotheca Historica that many of the most celebrated Greek philosophers made their way to Egypt and spent considerable time there studying with the Egyptian priests. He lists them directly. He names Pythagoras, Plato, Eudoxus, Democritus, and Oenopides among those who traveled to Egypt to be educated. He does not describe them as visitors, he describes them as students, men who sat beneath Egyptian priests and absorbed knowledge that they would later carry back to Greece and present, often without attribution, as their own discoveries. Let that settle in. Pythagoras, the man whose name adorns the most famous theorem in mathematics, was not self-taught. According to multiple ancient sources, including Iamblichus in his work on the life of Pythagoras, the philosopher spent approximately 22 years in Egypt being educated by the Egyptian priests. 22 years. That is not a study abroad program. That is a lifetime of education. Iamblichus writes that Pythagoras was introduced to the Egyptian priests through Thales of Miletus, another early Greek philosopher, who himself had studied in Egypt and came back transformed by what he had learned there. Thales reportedly urged the young Pythagoras to go to Egypt and study directly under the priests of Memphis and Diospolis, telling him that Egyptian knowledge was unmatched by anything in the Greek world. And so Pythagoras went. What did Pythagoras learn there? The Egyptians already had deep knowledge of mathematical relationships between numbers. They were building with precise geometric ratios and right-angle calculations long before Pythagoras was born. The relationship between the sides of a right triangle, what we call the Pythagorean theorem, was known in Egypt and Babylon centuries before Pythagoras. What Pythagoras did was systematize and formalize this knowledge and bring it back to a Greek audience that had never encountered it in that form. He took what he learned in the House of Life, wrapped it in Greek language and Greek philosophy, and became immortalized as a genius. The Egyptian priests who taught him received nothing, not even a footnote. Now let us talk about Plato. Plato is widely regarded as the greatest philosopher in Western history. His ideas about the soul, the ideal state, the nature of reality, the immortality of the mind, these are presented in academic institutions the world over as the crown jewels of human thought. But Plato did not emerge from a vacuum. According to the ancient writer Strabo, who recorded his observations in his work Geographica, Plato spent 13 years in Egypt being educated by the Egyptian priests. 13 years.
When he finally returned to Greece and began constructing his famous philosophical dialogues, the fingerprints of Egyptian thought were all over his ideas. Consider Plato's theory of forms. Plato argued that the material world we see around us is merely a shadow of a higher, truer reality, a world of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms that exist beyond physical perception. This sounds revolutionary, but this idea had existed in Egyptian religious and philosophical thought for centuries. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the divine principle of truth, order, justice, and cosmic balance, reflects precisely this understanding that beneath the chaos of the visible world lies a deeper, perfect order that the wise person must strive to perceive and embody. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, one of the oldest texts in human history, speaks of the soul's journey toward eternal truth and divine judgment. The language Plato uses in his dialogues about the immortality of the soul, about the soul's ascent toward truth, about the philosopher as one who sees beyond the shadows of the cave, all of this has clear precedent in Egyptian religious thought that predates him by thousands of years. Plato's most famous literary device, the allegory of the cave, describes people chained in a cave who can only see shadows on a wall, mistaking those shadows for reality. The philosopher is the one who breaks free, steps out of the cave, and perceives the true light. This allegory maps almost perfectly onto Egyptian mystery school teachings, in which the initiate moves from darkness and illusion into divine light and knowledge. The structure of the idea is not Plato's invention. It is Egypt's inheritance, wearing a Greek costume. Thales of Miletus, widely credited as the very first philosopher in the Western tradition, the man history calls the father of philosophy. What do we know about him? We know that he traveled to Egypt. We know that he studied under Egyptian priests. The ancient sources, including Proclus and Diogenes Laertius, tell us that Thales brought his mathematical and astronomical knowledge directly from Egypt. Thales was said to have predicted a solar eclipse, a feat that would have required sophisticated astronomical knowledge that Egyptian priests had been accumulating and recording for centuries. He learned to calculate the height of pyramids using shadow ratios, a technique that came directly from Egyptian mathematical practice. And he introduced geometry to the Greeks, but geometry was not his creation, it was Egypt's. The very word geometry means measuring the earth, and it was Egypt's annual flooding of the Nile, requiring the resurveying of farmland each year, that made Egypt the birthplace of practical geometry thousands of years before any Greek entered the picture. Solon, the great Athenian statesman and lawgiver, the man credited with laying the foundations of Athenian democracy and legal reform, he too traveled to Egypt. The ancient historian Plutarch, in his Life of Solon, describes the lawgiver spending time with Egyptian priests, including a priest named Sanches of Sais. In that conversation, the Egyptian priest reportedly told Solon something remarkable. He told him that the Greeks were like children compared to the Egyptians, that Greek civilization was young, untested, lacking the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years that Egypt possessed. Plato himself records this exchange in his dialogue Timaeus, where an Egyptian priest says to a Greek, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children, and there is no old man who is a Greek." The Egyptians were telling the Greeks directly, on the record, in texts that the Greeks themselves preserved, "You learned from us. You are not the origin." Eudoxus of Cnidus, one of the most brilliant mathematical and astronomical minds of early Greece, credited with contributions to proportion theory and planetary motion, spent time studying in Egypt under the priests. Diogenes Laertius records that Eudoxus lived in Egypt for 16 months, studying astronomy with the Egyptian priests at Heliopolis, one of the great centers of Egyptian knowledge. The astronomical knowledge he returned with became foundational to Greek science, but that knowledge did not spring up in Egypt in response to his arrival. It had been there, accumulated over millennia, waiting. Eudoxus did not generate it, he absorbed it, translated it, and carried it west. Hippocrates, the man every physician in the world still honors through the Hippocratic Oath, the father of medicine, was not working in a vacuum of ignorance. The Egyptians had been practicing sophisticated medicine for thousands of years before Hippocrates was born. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, which dates back over 3,500 years, contains detailed surgical observations, clinical descriptions of injury and disease, and a remarkably rational, non-supernatural approach to diagnosis and treatment. This is not superstition. This is systematic observation and medical reasoning. The Ebers Papyrus, another ancient Egyptian medical text, contains over 700 prescriptions, treatments, and medical observations. These documents predate Hippocrates by over 1,000 years. The Greek biographer Galen, in his own medical writings, acknowledged Egyptian medical knowledge as foundational. The ancient sources make clear that medical knowledge flowing from Egypt fed directly into what would later be packaged and celebrated as Greek medicine. George G.M. James, in his landmark work Stolen Legacy, published in 1954, made the argument systematically and powerfully that what is called Greek philosophy was largely borrowed from Egypt without proper credit. James argued that the Egyptian mystery schools, the institutionalized centers of learning associated with Egyptian temples, transmitted the philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine that the Greeks encountered, absorbed, and then claimed as their own. His work sparked enormous controversy precisely because it disturbed the comfortable narrative of Western civilization that locates its origins entirely in Greece, as if Greece appeared out of nowhere, as if the civilization sitting directly south of Greece across the Mediterranean, one of the oldest and richest civilizations on Earth, played no part in shaping what came next. Martin Bernal's work, Black Athena, published in 1987, went even further. Bernal, a scholar at Cornell University, argued through meticulous historical and linguistic analysis that Greek civilization was deeply influenced by African and Semitic cultures, and that a deliberate ideological shift in European scholarship, beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries, had systematically erased or minimized those African and Eastern influences in order to construct a narrative of European civilization that appeared purely self-generated. Bernal's work was attacked aggressively by establishment scholars, but the ferocity of the response itself was revealing. You do not attack a thesis with that intensity unless it is threatening something important. What was being threatened? The story. The foundational story that Western civilization, European civilization, invented itself. That reason, philosophy, science, mathematics, medicine, and democratic thought emerged organically from the Greek mind without significant influence from Africa. That story required Egypt to be treated as a backdrop, a source of mystery and decoration perhaps, but not a genuine intellectual tradition whose ideas were taken, systematized, and relabeled. But the ancient Greeks themselves never made that claim. The ancient Greeks were not embarrassed to say they had learned from Egypt. Herodotus, the father of Greek historiography, traveled to Egypt himself and was awed by what he found. He wrote openly in his histories that Greek religion owed enormous debts to Egypt, that Greek mathematical and geometric knowledge came from Egypt, that the Egyptians were among the most knowledgeable people on earth. He did not experience any shame in acknowledging Egyptian superiority in certain domains of knowledge. That shame was a later invention, a European Enlightenment era invention that needed to sever Greece from Africa in order to claim Greece as the exclusive ancestor of a Europe that was busy colonizing Africa. The rewriting was not subtle once you know where to look. Egyptian priests are transformed into mysterious, unknowable figures with no rational thought. Egypt becomes the land of superstition, while Greece becomes the land of reason. The fact that those Greek reasoners spent years studying under those supposedly superstitious priests is buried in footnotes or dismissed as legend. The scholars who raise the connections too loudly are attacked as ideologues. The erasure is not accidental, it is structured. But the ancient evidence remains, it was never fully destroyed. Iamblichus wrote it down, Diodorus Siculus recorded it, Strabo documented it, Plutarch preserved the conversations, Proclus acknowledged it. The ancient Greek tradition, in its own voice, in its own texts, testifies that the great minds of Greece went to Egypt and sat at the feet of Egyptian priests. 22 years for Pythagoras, 13 years for Plato, 16 months for Eudoxus. These are not brief visits. These are the educational journeys of men who knew they were going to a place of superior knowledge. What does this mean for how we understand history? It means we owe a debt to Africa that has never been properly acknowledged. It means the narrative of intellectual origins in the Western world is incomplete at best and dishonest at worst. It means that when you learn about the Pythagorean theorem, you should also learn about the Egyptian mathematical tradition that preceded it. When you study Plato's theory of the immortal soul, you should also study the Egyptian concept of the Ka and the Ba, and the journey of the soul through the Duat. When you hear the name Hippocrates and his rational approach to medicine, you should also know the name of the Edwin Smith Papyrus and the physicians who wrote it 3,000 years before he was born. Africa is not the dark continent waiting to be illuminated by outside knowledge. Africa was the lamp. Greece held the flame to the African torch and then told the world it had created fire. The truth does not diminish Greek achievement, it contextualizes it. Pythagoras was brilliant, Plato was brilliant. The work they did to systematize, articulate, and spread knowledge was real and significant. But brilliance built on a foundation is still brilliance built on a foundation. And that foundation was African, it was Egyptian, it was black. It was ancient, sophisticated, and systematically undercut by a historical tradition that needed Europe to appear self-created. The story is not over. It never was. Every time a student opens a philosophy textbook that begins with Thales without mentioning Egypt, that erasure continues. Every time a mathematics class celebrates Pythagoras without mentioning the Egyptian tradition he absorbed for 22 years, the story is told again in its incomplete, dishonest form. Every time a medical school recites the Hippocratic Oath without tracing the lineage of medical thought back through the Nile Valley, the debt goes unacknowledged. But you know now, and knowing is where everything begins. The real origin of Western philosophy was not in Athens. It was in the House of Life on the banks of the Nile. It was in the minds and temples and scrolls of a people who had been thinking deeply about the nature of the universe, the soul, justice, mathematics, and medicine for thousands of years before the first Greek philosopher ever crossed the Mediterranean. That people was African, that civilization was Egypt, and it is long past time the world said so clearly, without apology, and without hesitation.